welcome to The Bard's Truth with your host, the Green Bard. This is episode 6.5 of the Direwolves of Winterfell, Wights and a White Wolf. This episode focuses on Ghost's interaction with the Wights and the repercussions thereof at the end of A Game of Thrones. A Game of Thrones, Jon 6. Next time we see Ghost, it is when Sam and Jon go beyond the wall to take their vows. Recall how Sam uncharacteristically chooses to take his vows in front of the heart tree with Jon. It bears wondering if Ghost was a part of this as well. Ghost's obedience is on display in this scene, as well as the fear he instills in others, in this case, Marsh's horse, and perhaps Marsh himself. In any case, Ghost is off immediately after sniffing the air. Given that he later returns with a human hand from one of the Wights they find in the following chapter, one must wonder if he smelled the Wights right then, or if he initially was just going off to hunt. They never have. Jon climbed into the saddle when Bo and Marsh and their ranger escort had mounted. Jon put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. Ghost came loping out of the tunnel. The Lord Steward Scaran whickered and backed away from the direwolf. "Do you mean to take that beast?" "Yes, my lord," Jon said. Ghost's head lifted. He seemed to taste the air. In the blink of an eye, he was off, racing across the broad, weed-choked field to vanish in the trees. When Ghost returns, Jon notices, with some disquiet, how Ghost resembles the weirwoods. He resembles the old gods. We the readers know that, as an albino, he also resembles the Ghost of High Heart and Bloodraven as well, both conduits of the old gods. One might even suggest that Bloodraven, as the current resident greenseer at the Cave of the Children of the Forest, is a proxy for the old gods. This is one reason I do give some credence to the idea that Ghost could be a tool for one such as Bloodraven. Ghost obediently brings his grisly prize to Jon when called, but one wonders why he was not guarding Jon during this relatively exposed time. Should his protective instinct have won out versus his hunt for the Wights? I guess he decided Jon wasn't in any danger going to the grove. And suddenly Ghost was back, stalking softly between the 2 weirwoods. White fur and red eyes, Jon realized, disquieted, like the trees. The wolf had something in his jaws, something black. "What's he got there?" asked Bo and Marsh, frowning. "To me, Ghost," Jon knelt. "Bring it here." The direwolf trotted to him. Jon heard Samwell Tarly's sharp intake of breath. Of course, Sam was reacting to the hand inside Ghost's mouth, the hand of the Wight. A Game of Thrones, Jon 7. Early in the next chapter, we learn that, among the animals, only Ghost is unafraid of the Wights. The other animals go crazy around them. The dogs will not even track them when given the scent. Why is Ghost different in this case? A few ideas come to mind. I'll list them here. 1. Perhaps a direwolf naturally doesn't have an instinct to fear Wights like the other beasts. I can't eliminate this possibility, but I do question it. This type of self-preservation instinct would presumably be quite important for any species that has survived beyond the wall for the past 8,000 plus years. 2. Ghost is different because of the Warg bond. Most readers may assume this is how Ghost is different, as I once did. While it is possible that this is part of the truth, it may not be the whole truth. Another weakness in this concept is that the beast ought reflect his Warg's feelings on this matter, and Jon seems quite scared himself. Ghost should mirror this or emanate calm to Jon, but neither happens in this case. 3. Maybe Ghost is different because of the telepathic abilities he possesses. This may be partly true, but I can't see how this would cause him to go against his self-preservation instincts. And then finally, number 4. Bloodraven or the old gods led him there, for some purpose of their own. This is Preston Jacobs' take on it, and I can't think of a better idea. Bloodraven using greenseer magic to interrupt the connection between Jon and Ghost and assert some level of control of Ghost would explain how Ghost could so fully shirk his natural self-preservation instinct and his protective instinct. Let's keep this in mind as we listen to the following passage. "Gods have mercy," the old bear muttered. He swung down from his garron, handing his reins to Jon. The morning was unnaturally warm. Beads of sweat dotted the Lord Commander's broad forehead, like dew on a melon. His horse was nervous, rolling her eyes, backing away from the dead men as far as her lead would allow. Jon led her off a few paces, fighting to keep her from bolting. The horses did not like the feel of this place. For that matter, neither did Jon. The dogs liked it least of all. Ghost had led the party here. The pack of hounds had been useless. When Bass the kennel master had tried to get them to take the scent from the severed hand, they had gone wild, yowling and barking, fighting to get away. Even now they were snarling and whimpering by turns, pulling at their leashes while Chet cursed them for curs. It is only a wood, Jon told himself, and they're only dead men. He had seen dead men before. Of course, now we know they weren't just dead men, they were Wights. George does a great job foreshadowing that right here. In a dream Jon had had the night before, his subconscious either already knows through his bond with Ghost that the hand came from the Wights, or somebody like Bloodraven sent him the dream. In any case, I assume that Ghost experienced the dream as with Jon's prior dreams. This is evidenced in how he again nuzzles at Jon's face after the nightmare. Given this, he ought to be mirroring Jon's unease at the situation, but this doesn't happen. Ghost doesn't mirror Jon's fear at all in relation to the Wights. He's unflappable. This contrast seems to bolster the idea of the old gods influencing Ghost's behavior in this scene. The dichotomy is also reminiscent of later events that reek of the involvement of the Children of the Forest and Lord Bloodraven, such as when Ghost finds the dragon glass daggers. Last night he had dreamt the Winterfell dream again. He was wandering the empty castle, searching for his father, descending into the crypts. Only this time, the dream had gone further than before. In the dark, he'd heard the scrape of stone on stone. When he turned, he saw that the vaults were opening, one after the other. As the dead kings came stumbling from their cold black graves, Jon had woken in pitch dark, his heart hammering. Even when Ghost leapt up on the bed to nuzzle at his face, he could not shake his deep sense of terror. He dared not go back to sleep. Instead, he climbed the wall and walked, restless, until he saw the light of dawn off to the east. It was only a dream. I'm a brother of the Night's Watch now, not a frightened boy. Or it wasn't just a dream. Perhaps someone was trying to tell him that the dead will walk again. Jon later uses Ghost directly to get Sam to overcome his fear of the Wights, and it works. Ghost's calming influence on Sam seems to remain during this interaction. I interpret this to be Ghost mirroring his feelings to Sam. Jon put a hand on Sam's shoulder. We have 12 rangers with us, and the dogs, even Ghost. No one will hurt you, Sam. Go ahead and look. The first look is the hardest. While Sam makes the case that the Wights were not killed there, he also notes again that Ghost is different from the other beasts in his lack of fear. In my experience, repetition of evidence like this is typical for George R. R. Martin when he's trying to point out something important. This is a good place to speculate as to how and why Ghost initially found the Wights. As we decided earlier, Bloodraven may be the reason that Ghost is unafraid of the Wights. I suspect that Bloodraven is also the reason that Ghost went to find the Wights. The alternative is that he just followed his sense of smell, but by adopting this explanation you have to conclude that he has no instinctual fear of the Wights, and I don't buy that. This is basically saying that his instinct to hunt knows no bounds. Instead, I find the idea compelling that Bloodraven took control or heavily influenced Ghost in both this and the last chapter, just as Ghost crossed beyond the wall. It would explain why Ghost did not mirror Jon's dread before. One thing we see here with Sam is that he only gains the courage to speak once Jon mentions that Ghost was there to protect them. Indeed, I'd say that Ghost is almost broadcasting calm or a lack of fear to both Jon and Sam. Jon seems calmed by him in the final paragraph in the upcoming passage, just as they were all finally accepting the idea that the bodies were Wights. The wolf is giving both boys courage. If our normal pattern of mirroring held here, Ghost should be freaking out in reflection of Jon's emotions. It is the opposite. Jon is inwardly freaking out, but calmed by Ghost's presence. Sam mopped at the sweat on his brow. You can see where Ghost, Jon's direwolf, you can see where he tore off the man's hand, and yet the stump hasn't bled. Look. He waved a hand. My father, Lord Randall, He made me watch him dress animals sometimes, after. Sam shook his head from side to side, his chins quivering. Now that he looked at the bodies, he could not seem to look away. A fresh kill. The blood would still flow, my lords. Later it would be clotted like a jelly. Thick and he looked as though he was going to be sick. This man, look at the wrist. It's all crusty, dry, like. They aren't rotting, Sam pointed, his fat finger shaking only a little. Look, there's no maggots or worms or anything. They've been lying there in the woods, but they haven't been chewed or eaten by animals, only Ghost. Otherwise they're untouched, Jon said softly, and Ghost is different. The dogs and horses won't go near them. Later, a silence fell over the wood. For a moment, all they heard was Sam's heavy breathing and the sound of Tywin sucking on his teeth. Jon squatted beside Ghost. Note that Jon's calm and understanding coincides with Ghost beginning to shadow him. Jon being calmed by Ghost's presence is further indicated in the next paragraph. In the inverse, Jon feels naked, i.e. exposed, out in the cold, when Ghost leaves them. Ghost, on the other hand, has no worry at all. He just went off to hunt, a direwolf doing direwolf things. Ghost ran with them for a time and then vanished among the trees. Without the direwolf, Jon felt almost naked. He found himself glancing at every shadow with unease. Unbidden, he thought back on the tales that old Nan used to tell them when he was a boy at Winterfell. He could almost hear her voice again, and the click, click, click of her needles. In that darkness, the others came riding, she used to say, dropping her voice lower and lower. Later, when they emerged from under the trees, Mormont spurred his tough little Garen to a trot. Ghost came streaking out of the woods to meet them, licking his chops, his muzzle red from prey. Jon, after learning of Ned's imprisonment, later in the chapter, is further calmed by Ghost. We also get a reminder of his empathy in his thoughts about his sisters. The rest of the afternoon passed as if in a dream. Jon could not have said where he walked, what he did, who he spoke with. Ghost was with him, he knew that much. The silent presence of the direwolf gave him comfort. The girls do not even have that much, he thought. Their wolves might have kept them safe, but Lady is dead, and Nymeria's lost. They're all alone. After that last passage, focused on Ghost's calming influence, Jon rages at Alliser Thorne and is confined to quarters. Preston Jacobs suggests that this is also due to Ghost's influence. I disagree. I believe it more likely to be Jon's own natural reaction, and potentially his failure to keep Ghost and his calming influence nearby. Ghost's calm or lack of fear is evident throughout the chapter, save in this scene. Regardless, the passage has no mention of Ghost, so we'll not cover it further, save to say that bad things happen when the wolves are separated from their Starks. The next mention of Ghost is when Jon and he are confined to quarters that night. In fact, Ghost continues to calm Jon at that mention, just by his company. Jon then has a one-sided conversation with Ghost, before immediately interacting with a candle, then sleeping for a long while. Preston Jacobs suggests that there is something supernatural about this candle sequence, which may be true, but it could also be that Ghost's calming influence simply enabled Jon to let go of his rage and to sleep. Up to this point in the chapter, that had been the clear influence Ghost provided Jon through the bond, so it makes sense that it continues until Jon rests. Ghost's behavior changes when Jon wakes, as he senses the Wight in the Lord Commander's tower. It is clear protective behavior. He senses the danger and acts on it. His hackles are up, and he's ready for a fight, silently snarling. Preston Jacobs also suggests that Bloodraven arranged this scene. Here I agree with him, at least to an extent, because of the timing of the event. It always bothered me that Ghost didn't wake Jon until well after the guard was killed. It is certainly possible that Bloodraven arranged things so that Jon came out of it as a hero, and for that he'd need to valiantly save Mormont. Delaying Jon's waking enables this. Ghost, logically, should have sensed the danger much earlier than when Jon woke. And we have evidence that perhaps he did. There were deep gouges where he'd raked the wood. This may mean that he'd been trying to get at the Wight for a while. Why did Jon not wake until well after the Wight was past the guard at his door? I submit that he may have been in a trance, put in effect by staring at that candle, a hypnosis, perhaps. Ghost, who we know can call to Jon telepathically, see the first chapter the Direwolves appear in, may have been cut off from Jon when he was in this state, or Jon would have awakened much sooner. They took his knife and his sword and told him he was not to leave his cell until the high officers met to decide what was to be done with him, and they placed a guard outside his door to make certain he obeyed. His friends were not allowed to see him, but the old bear did relent and permit him Ghost, so he was not utterly alone. "My father is no traitor," he told the direwolf when the rest had gone. Ghost looked at him in silence. Jon slumped against the wall, hands around his knees, and stared at the candle on the table beside his narrow bed. The flame flickered and swayed. The shadows moved around him. The room seemed to grow darker and colder. I will not sleep tonight, Jon thought. Yet he must have dozed. When he woke, his legs were stiff, cramped, and the candle had long since burned out. Ghost stood on his hind legs, scrabbling at the door. Jon was startled to see how tall he'd grown. "Ghost, what is it?" he called softly. The direwolf turned his head and looked down at him, baring his fangs in a silent snarl. "Has he gone mad?" Jon wondered. "It's me, Ghost," he murmured, trying not to sound afraid. Yet he was trembling violently. When had it gotten so cold? Ghost had backed away from the door. There were deep gouges where he'd raked the wood. Jon watched him with mounting disquiet. "There's someone out there, isn't there?" he whispered. Crouching, the direwolf crept backward, white fur rising on the back of his neck. The guard, he thought. They left a man to guard my door. Ghost smells him through the door. That's all it is. Once they're out the door, the direwolf is leading Jon to the Wight, waiting to make sure that Jon is coming. As they move up the steps, Ghost mirrors Jon's carefulness. The Lord Commander's raven, well established as a tool of Bloodraven, breaks this spell, and Ghost runs ahead, starting the fight. Ghost slid past him, out the door. The wolf started up the steps, stopped, looked back at Jon. That was when he heard it, the soft scrape of boot on stone, the sound of a latch turning. The sounds came from above, from the Lord Commander's chambers. A nightmare this may be, yet it was no dream. The guard's sword was in its sheath. Jon knelt and worked it free. The heft of steel in his fist made him bolder. He moved up the steps, Ghost padding silently before him. Shadows lurked in every turn of the stair. Jon crept up warily, probing any suspicious darkness with the point of his sword. Suddenly he heard the shriek of Mormont's raven. "Corn!" the bird said, screaming. "Corn, corn, 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 corn!" Ghost bounded ahead, and Jon came scrambling after. The door to Mormont's solar was wide open. The direwolf plunged through. Jon stopped in the doorway, blade in hand, giving his eyes a moment to adjust. Heavy drapes had been pulled across the windows. The darkness was black as ink. "Who's there?" he called out. Then he saw it, a shadow in the shadows, sliding toward the inner door that led to Mormont's sleeping cell. A man-shape all in black, cloaked and hooded, but beneath the hood, its eyes shone with an icy blue radiance. During the fight, Ghost and Jon alternate in defense and attack. Every moment need not be analyzed, but every mention of Ghost in the fight is in the passage that follows. Ghost certainly is protecting Jon throughout, and his attacks are savage, continuing our direwolf themes. The spot that is potentially supernatural would be between Jon and the bird. Who has the idea to burn the Wight first? Jon or Bloodraven, skin-changing the bird? Did he use the bird or Ghost to give Jon the idea? There's no definitive evidence for how Jon got the idea. Jon did grab the lamp before the bird said burn, so it's definitely not on the page that Jon got the idea from the bird. What we know is that he got the lamp, the bird said burn, he burnt the drapes, called off Ghost, who obeys immediately, indicating a strong bond at this instant, and kills the Wight with the burning drapes. Ghost leapt. Man and wolf went down together with neither scream nor snarl, rolling, smashing into a chair. knocking over a table laden with papers. Mormont's raven was flapping overhead, screaming, "Corn! Corn! Corn! Corn!" Jon felt as blind as Maester Aemon. Keeping the wall to his back, he slid toward the window and ripped down the curtain. Moonlight flooded the solar. He glimpsed black hands buried in white fur, swollen dark fingers tightening around the direwolf's throat. Ghost was twisting and snapping, legs flailing in the air, but he could not break free. Jon had no time to be afraid. He threw himself forward, shouting, bringing down the longsword with all his weight behind it. Steel sheared through the sleeve and bone and skin, yet the sound was wrong somehow. The smell that engulfed him was so quiet and cold he almost gagged. He saw arm and hand land on the floor, black fingers wriggling in a pool of moonlight. Ghost wrenched free of the other hand and crept away, red tongue lolling from his mouth. Later. The corpse lurched forward. There was no blood. One-armed, face cut near in half, it seemed to feel nothing. Jon held the longsword before him. "Stay away," he commanded, his voice gone shrill. "Corn!" screamed the raven. "Corn! Corn!" The severed arm was wriggling out of its torn sleeve. A pale snake with a black five-fingered head. Ghost pounced and got it between his teeth. Finger bones crunched. Jon hacked at the corpse's neck, felt the steel bite deep and hard. Later. And suddenly the corpse's weight was gone, its fingers ripped from his throat. It was all Jon could do to roll over, retching and shaking. Ghost had it again. He watched as the direwolf buried his teeth in the Wight's gut and began to rip and tear. He watched, only half conscious, for a long moment before he finally remembered to look for his sword, and saw Lord Mormont, naked and groggy from sleep, standing in the doorway with an oil lamp in his hand. Gnawed and fingerless, the arm thrashed on the floor, wriggling toward him. Jon tried to shout, but his voice was gone. Staggering to his feet, he kicked the arm away and snatched the lamp from the old bear's fingers. The flame flickered and almost died. "Burn!" the raven crawled. "Burn! Burn! Burn!" Spinning, Jon saw the drapes he'd ripped from the window. He flung the lamp into the puddled cloth with both hands. Metal crunched, glass shattered, oil spewed, and the hangings went up in a great whoosh of flame. The heat of it on his face was sweeter than any kiss Jon had ever known. "Ghost!" he shouted. The direwolf wrenched free and came to him as the Wight struggled to rise, dark snakes spilling from the great wound in its belly. Jon plunged his hand into the flames, grabbed a fistful of the burning drapes, and whipped them at the dead man. "Let it burn," he prayed as the cloth smothered the corpse. "Gods, please, please, let it burn." A Game of Thrones, Jon 8. Next, we see the results of those events. Ghost and Jon are recognized as heroes with the gift of the Valyrian steel blade, forged in magic, and Jon's nemesis, Thorn, is sent away. If there had been a plot by the old gods to elevate Jon in the Watch, it worked. The subsequent discussion of the likeness of Ghost on the blade reminds me also of his likeness to the Weirwoods, with the eyes darker than garnets and wiser than men line. Jon also remembers how Ghost was found apart from his siblings. He thinks it was because of Ghost's look being different from his littermates, but I suggested earlier that it could be that Bloodraven caused Ghost to move away, not the other pups. There is no strong reason to think Jon's supposition here is the correct one. The unreliable narrator trope may be at work. We are also reminded that Jon heard Ghost, but Ghost never makes a sound. Jon still doesn't seem to notice this glaring issue with his memory. I do wonder why our author chose this point in the story to remind us of this again. Is it to tell us that Jon is unreliable as a narrator on why Ghost was driven off? Or is it something else? I couldn't say for sure, but using the recollection to again point out Ghost's telepathic gift is highest on my list of guesses. Mormont snorted. "Because I sent him. Why do you think? He's bringing the hand your ghost tore off the end of Jafer Flowers' wrist. I have commanded him to take ship to King's Landing and lay it before this boy king. That should get young Joffrey's attention, I'd think. And Sir Alistair's a knight, high-born, anointed, with old friends at court, altogether harder to ignore than a glorified crow." "Crow." Jon thought the raven sounded faintly indignant. Bloodraven again? Later. They had moved him back to his old cell in tumble-down Harden's Tower after the fire, and it was there he returned. Ghost was curled up asleep beside the door, but he lifted his head at the sound of Jon's boots. The direwolf's red eyes were darker than garnets and wiser than men. Jon knelt, scratched his ear, and showed him the pommel of his sword. "Look, it's you." Ghost sniffed at his carved likeness and tried a lick. Jon smiled. "You're the one deserves an honor," he told the wolf. And suddenly he found himself remembering how he'd found him that day in the late summer snow. They had been riding off with the other pups, but Jon had heard a noise and turned back. And there he was, white fur, almost invisible against the drifts. He was all alone, he thought, apart from the others in the litter. He was different, so they drove him out. Reflecting on Jon's logic again, it also can be that both my theory and his logic are sound. Ghost is different from the other direwolves, just as Jon is different from his Stark siblings. But just because Jon's logic is sound from a metaphorical standpoint, doesn't mean he's actually right about his supposition. Bloodraven planned it all. And with that, we'll see you next time.
So high the wall above my eyes, but once I watched.
Thanks to all the terrific artists who let me use their work on this YouTube video.
Songs of love, her bell I'd ring in the window, but lies should sing. It's so lonely.
Thanks especially to those in my family who helped in this series so far.
It's so lonely neath the shade of the wall.
If you enjoy this content, you can also consider supporting us on Patreon.